The storm had come without warning, sweeping across the small town of Brooksville with a ferocity that sent the residents scurrying into their homes for shelter. The wind howled like a wild beast, rattling windows and shaking the trees. Rain poured down in torrents, turning the dirt roads into rivers of muddy water. Outside, the world was a blur of gray, the trees bending under the force of the storm as the skies roared in protest. Inside, the homes were warm and bright, their lights flickering softly through the windows as families huddled together, seeking comfort in the midst of the chaos. In one such house, a small cottage nestled at the edge of the forest, Lily sat curled up by the fire, her legs tucked beneath her in the cozy living room. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the rhythmic patter of rain against the roof. She had always loved the comfort of this little house, the way it felt like a safe haven from the world outside. Her grandmother, who lived with her, sat in a rocking chair by the window, knitting quietly as she watched the storm rage beyond the glass. The warmth of the fire and the soft light of the lamps made the small house feel like a world apart from the storm, a place where nothing could hurt them. Lily's heart, however, was not at rest. Her mind was filled with thoughts of animals, of the wild creatures that roamed the woods near their home. Ever since she could remember, Lily had loved animals more than anything. She spent hours outside, exploring the forest, watching the deer and squirrels, and dreaming of one day becoming a veterinarian so she could help creatures in need. Her grandmother often told her that she had a special way with animals, a bond that seemed to go beyond mere observation. But Lily's dreams were always bigger than what her small town could offer. She longed to make a real difference, to be out there in the world, helping those who couldn't help themselves. But tonight, in the midst of the storm, those dreams seemed far away. She looked out the window at the rain-swept trees, the wind bending their branches as if they were reaching for something just out of reach. The storm was fierce, but Lily had seen worse before. The weather in Brooksville was unpredictable, and it wasn't uncommon for storms to sweep through, bringing down trees, knocking out power lines, and causing chaos. Still, there was something different about this storm. Something that made Lily uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Then, as if to confirm her suspicions, she heard it, a faint, barely audible sound carried on the wind, rising above the howling gusts and the drumming of rain. At first, Lily thought it was just her imagination, the storm playing tricks on her ears. But then, it came again, a faint cry. It was weak, almost lost in the storm. But it was there, a desperate sound, like a cry for help. Lily's heart skipped a beat, her eyes wide with alarm. She stood up from the chair, straining to hear the sound again. But the storm was so loud that it was hard to tell if it was real or just a figment of her imagination. "Grandma, did you hear that?" Lily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her grandmother looked up from her knitting, her brow furrowed with concern. "Hear what, darling?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging outside. Lily paused, her mind racing. It was a cry, a sound, like someone or something calling for help. Her grandmother set her knitting down, her face softening with worry. "Oh, Lily, don't be silly. It's just the wind, playing tricks on you. You know how storms can make strange noises. There's nothing to be afraid of." But Lily wasn't so sure. She had spent enough time in the woods to know that the wind didn't sound like that. It wasn't the normal creaking of branches or the howl of gusts. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to the storm. "I think it came from outside," Lily insisted. Maybe someone's in trouble. I have to go check." Her grandmother's face hardened with concern. "Lily, no, you stay here. You hear me? It's too dangerous out there in this weather. The storm's too strong, and you can't go wandering off in the dark. We'll just wait it out. And everything will be fine." But Lily could hardly ignore the feeling growing inside her. The urgency of the cry she had heard. She had always trusted her instincts when it came to animals. And something told her that this wasn't a trick of the wind. She glanced out the window once more, her eyes scanning the trees that seemed to sway violently under the force of the storm. The darkness of the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and the idea of leaving the warmth and safety of the house was frightening. But the cry, that faint sound, gnawed at her. "I have to go, Grandma," Lily said, her voice filled with determination. "I have to see if someone needs help." Before her grandmother could protest further, Lily grabbed her raincoat from the hook by the door, slipping it on over her pajamas. She pulled the hood up over her head and stepped toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm was fierce, and every part of her wanted to stay safe inside. But the feeling in her gut told her that she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't just pretend that nothing was wrong. Her grandmother tried to stop her, but Lily was already halfway to the door. "Please, Grandma," she said, turning back for just a moment. "I'll be careful, I promise." With that, Lily opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, and the rain came down in sheets, drenching her instantly. The trees around her howled, their branches creaking and groaning under the pressure. Lily squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The path to the woods was just a few steps away, and the sound of the wind seemed to carry the cry with it, almost like a faint whisper between the gusts. She hesitated for just a moment, looking back toward the warmth of the house. But then her resolve hardened. She had to find out what was out there. There was something she needed to do, and she couldn't let fear stop her. Lily stepped forward, her boots sinking into the mud as she made her way toward the trees, determined to find the source of the cry that had called out to her in the night. The wind howled fiercely around Lily as she stepped out of the warmth and safety of the house. The door slamming shut behind her. The rain came down in sheets, instantly soaking her clothes, but she barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on the faint sound she had heard earlier. That desperate cry carried on the wind. She pulled her hood tighter over her head and squinted against the driving rain, her eyes scanning the dark garden behind the house. The world around her was a blur of shadow and movement, the trees swaying and creaking under the storm's rage. Each gust of wind seemed to drown out the sound of her own heartbeat. But she still felt that urgency inside her, pushing her forward. She moved carefully, trying to make her way through the garden toward the sound she had heard. The grass was slick underfoot, and the path was almost invisible in the downpour. But Lily knew the layout of the yard well. She had spent countless hours playing here, running through the garden, exploring the woods, and learning about the plants and animals that surrounded her home. But tonight, it felt different. The storm had turned the familiar into something ominous, and every step she took seemed to be a step into the unknown. As she neared the back corner of the garden, the sound grew clearer. It was unmistakable now, a low, plaintive whine that pierced through the storm, coming from somewhere near the large oak tree. Lily's heart raced as she approached the tree, her breath catching in her throat. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. Tied to the thick trunk of the oak tree, a large German shepherd was crouched on the ground, its body trembling in fear and pain. The dog's fur was matted and dirty, streaked with mud and filth from the storm. It had clearly been out here for some time, suffering in the rain. The dog's belly was swollen with pregnancy, its ribs clearly visible beneath its fur, showing how malnourished it was. The poor animal was tied to the tree with a short, tight chain, which had likely been there for days, perhaps even weeks. Its eyes were wide with terror as it looked up at Lily, its body stiff with fear. The dog's tail was pressed between its legs, and it whimpered softly, as if in pain. Lily felt a wave of compassion rush through her as she took in the sight of the dog. She could see the rawness of its wounds, the signs of neglect and mistreatment, and she instinctively knew that the dog was in desperate need of help. The dog's eyes, full of fear and confusion, locked with hers. It was as if the dog was silently pleading for her to do something, to help it escape from this torment. Lily's heart ached. She had always been sensitive to the suffering of animals. But this was different. This was not just a stray dog that needed food or shelter. This was an animal in pain. An animal that had been abandoned and left to suffer, its trust in humans shattered by whatever cruelty had been inflicted upon it. And now, Lily knew she couldn't just stand there and do nothing. She had to help. Taking a deep breath, Lily stepped closer to the dog, careful not to make any sudden movements. She didn't want to startle it, not when it was already so frightened. The rain pelted her skin, but she barely noticed it. All she could focus on was the dog and the pitiful sound it made as it whimpered again. She knelt down slowly, trying to appear as calm and non-threatening as possible, though her heart was racing in her chest. The dog's eyes flickered between her face and the chain that held it captive. Its fear palpable. "It's okay," Lily whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I'm here to help." The dog's breathing was shallow and uneven, and it looked as though it might collapse from exhaustion. Lily could see that the chain had cut into the dog's skin, leaving raw, angry marks on its neck. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, but the dog flinched away, growling low in its throat. It was understandable. It had been hurt and abandoned. And now here was another person, a stranger, approaching, but Lily could see that the dog was not aggressive. It was scared, confused, and in pain. She understood that. "Please," Lily whispered again, her heart breaking as she watched the dog's struggle. She reached into the small pouch she had tied to her waist, pulling out a piece of meat she had brought with her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get the dog's attention. She held the meat out, slowly and carefully, trying to coax the dog to her. For a long moment, the dog didn't move, its eyes still filled with uncertainty. But then, after a moment of hesitation, the dog's nose twitched, and it inched forward, sniffing the air. Its eyes locked with Lily's again, and for the first time, Lily saw something different, a flicker of hope, or perhaps trust, in those sad, fearful eyes. The dog slowly moved toward her, and Lily's heart leaped in her chest. She gently placed the piece of meat on the ground, watching as the dog, still cautious but desperate, ate the food. The dog was so hungry, so weak, that it barely seemed to notice her presence anymore. Lily reached out, gently touching the dog's fur. And this time, the dog didn't flinch. It only whimpered softly, as though too tired to resist. Lily knew she couldn't just leave the dog there. It needed immediate help, food, water, and care. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving the dog, as she considered what to do next. Her grandmother would never approve of her going this far into the storm. But Lily couldn't bear to leave the dog in its suffering. She ran back to the house as quickly as she could, gathering the supplies she needed, a leash, some food, and a blanket. As she made her way back to the oak tree, the storm continued to rage. But Lily's determination had only grown stronger. She couldn't just save this dog for one night. She had to make sure it got the care it needed. The chance at a new life. When she returned, she gently wrapped the blanket around the German shepherd's shoulders, securing it as best as she could. She could see the exhaustion in the dog's eyes, and it broke her heart to think of the pain and fear it had endured. But as she guided the dog away from the tree and toward the warmth of the cabin, she felt a sense of hope rise inside her. This dog might have suffered, but with her help, it could have a chance at recovery. Lily knew she would do whatever it took to save it. Lily moved carefully toward the German shepherd, her heart aching as she noticed just how much pain the dog was in. The storm continued to roar around them, the wind howling and the rain falling in torrents. But Lily's focus was solely on the dog in front of her. The large, swollen belly of the shepherd, the deep, painful marks on its neck, and the fearful, pleading look in its eyes all weighed heavily on her heart. She gently knelt beside the dog, her hand extending toward its head. The dog flinched, but it didn't retreat. It seemed exhausted, not just from the chain, but from everything it had endured. Lily could sense the fear in the dog, but also a deep, desperate need for help. A need that made her more determined than ever to act. "Shush. It's okay," Lily whispered soothingly, her voice barely audible over the wind. She gently ran her hand down the dog's fur, trying to calm it. The shepherd let out a soft whine, its eyes closing momentarily as if it appreciated the comforting touch. Lily's fingers brushed against the cold, rough surface of the chain that bound the dog to the tree. She felt a pang of guilt as she realized just how tightly the chain was wound around the dog's neck. It wasn't just tied, it was embedded in the skin, cutting deeply into the flesh. The collar had been worn so long that the fur had been rubbed raw beneath it. And there were visible signs of infection. Lily's hands trembled as she tried to remove the chain. But it was so tightly wound that it wouldn't budge. She tried pulling at the metal. But it felt like the more she pulled, the tighter it seemed to get. The dog whimpered, its body shaking from fear. And the painful cries only spurred Lily on. She couldn't bear to see it suffer any longer. Frustration began to rise within her as she realized the chain wouldn't loosen without help. The storm was too strong. And the darkness of the night made everything harder. The wind had picked up even more, the rain falling so heavily that it was nearly impossible to see anything clearly. The cold rain stung her skin as she looked desperately at the chain, trying to figure out how she could free the dog. Her mind raced, searching for a solution, but in the face of the relentless storm, the situation seemed impossible. Her hands were numb from the cold, and the storm made every movement feel like a struggle. The urgency of the moment was overwhelming. She needed help. She had to get inside and ask her grandmother to come assist her. She couldn't do it alone. Without thinking twice, Lily stood up and turned to run back toward the house. She could hear the wind and rain battering the sides of the cottage. And the trees outside were shaking violently. The storm was so loud. It almost drowned out her thoughts. Her boots slipped in the mud as she made her way toward the door, her heart pounding with every step. The dog needed her, but she needed help too. She reached the door and flung it open, her soaked clothes sticking to her body as she called out for her grandmother. "Grandma, Grandma, help!" she shouted over the roar of the wind. But her voice was swallowed by the storm. She stepped further into the house, hoping to hear some response. But the sound of the storm outside was deafening. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. Her grandmother must have been in the back of the house, too far to hear her cries. Or the storm was simply too loud to be heard over the howling wind. Lily called out again, but there was no response. Panic began to rise in her chest. She couldn't waste any more time. The dog was still out there, suffering, and Lily knew she couldn't leave it alone any longer. She turned back toward the door. But as she looked outside, the storm's fury seemed to intensify. The wind slammed against the house like a battering ram, and Lily felt as though the world was closing in on her. The night was so dark and the rain so thick that she could barely make out anything past the tree line. Her mind raced as she struggled to calm herself. She couldn't afford to panic. There was a dog out there that needed her. She quickly pulled the door shut behind her and stepped back into the night, where the storm still raged without mercy. The air was thick with moisture, the wind cutting through her clothes, making her shiver uncontrollably. She turned toward the oak tree again, her eyes scanning the wet darkness for any sign of the German shepherd. She had to get the chain off, but she had no tools. Her hands were still slick and cold from the rain, and she had no way of cutting through the thick metal of the chain. The weight of it all, the dog's pain, and her own helplessness, pressed down on her like a heavy stone. Lily approached the dog again, her heart hammering in her chest as she knelt down beside it. The dog's eyes met hers again, wide with pain and fear. But there was also something else there. Something that said it was holding on. Waiting for her. She had to act. She couldn't leave the dog out here to die. The storm may have been fierce, but Lily was more determined than ever to help the creature in front of her. She reached for the chain again, pulling at it with all her might. But the metal felt unyielding. The dog let out another weak whimper, and Lily could hear the distress in the sound. It sounded so broken, so utterly lost. Lily felt a surge of helplessness wash over her. But she pushed it down. She couldn't stop now. Not when the dog needed her more than ever. Without another thought, she jumped to her feet and dashed toward the house once more. The storm seemed to want to push her away. But she wasn't going to let it stop her. She ran through the mud, splashing water everywhere, until she reached the back door of the house. She grabbed a sharp knife from the kitchen drawer and dashed back outside, hoping she could cut through the chain this time. Her hands were shaking, but her determination was stronger than the fear that had been building in her chest. When she returned to the oak tree, the dog was still there, watching her with those sad, pleading eyes. The chain was still tight. But now, with the knife in her hand, Lily was ready. She knelt down once again, trying to stay calm as she pressed the sharp blade to the metal. The rain and wind made it difficult, but Lily focused all her attention on the task at hand. She could feel the cold blade biting into the chain, and with one final, desperate pull, it snapped. The chain was broken. Relief flooded through Lily as she gently lifted the dog's head, easing it away from the tree. The dog let out a soft whine, its body still weak and trembling. But it was free. The German Shepherd, exhausted but grateful, licked Lily's face, its eyes softening as it finally relaxed. Lily smiled through her exhaustion, feeling a deep sense of relief and joy. The storm was still raging, but for now, the dog was safe, and so was she. Lily's hands trembled as she finally pried the thick metal chain off the German Shepherd's neck. The weight of the chain had been oppressive, cutting deep into the dog's flesh. But now, with the chain broken, the dog was free. The shepherd's breathing was shallow, its body trembling from both exhaustion and pain. But it was no longer tethered to the tree, no longer a prisoner of the storm. Lily stood up, a wave of relief washing over her as she gently placed her hands under the dog's belly, supporting it as it tried to stand. The dog was weak, but there was a glimmer of recognition in its eyes as it looked up at Lily, its tail wagging faintly. Lily could feel the animal's frailty in her hands. The dog was weak, its legs shaking, but it was determined to stand. Slowly, she guided the dog toward the house, her heart pounding as she supported its weight. The rain had soaked them both, but Lily barely noticed. She was focused only on getting the dog inside, out of the storm. The wind howled and the rain continued to pour, but they were almost at the door. When they reached the porch, Lily carefully helped the dog inside, her grandmother's house offering a warm refuge from the raging storm. The smell of wood and warmth greeted him as Lily closed the door behind them. She led the dog to the small living room, where the warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth. Her grandmother was sitting by the window, still knitting, but when she saw Lily enter with the dog, she stopped. her face turning pale with concern. "Lily, what on earth have you brought in?" Her grandmother's voice was filled with surprise and worry. "You're soaked. And look at this poor creature. What happened?" Lily could hardly speak through the lump in her throat. "I found her outside. She was chained to a tree. All alone. And she needs help." Her grandmother's eyes softened with understanding. But she was still clearly alarmed. "Get her to the fire. Quickly. Let's get her dry and see what we can do." Lily helped the dog settle on the rug near the fire, carefully laying a towel over her to keep her warm. The shepherd, though weak, seemed to relax as the warmth of the fire reached her soaked fur. Lily stroked the dog gently, whispering soft words of comfort, though she had no idea what had caused the dog's suffering or why she had been abandoned in such a state. The more Lily looked at the dog, the more she realized just how much pain the poor creature had endured. It was clear she was near the end of her pregnancy, but it was equally clear that she had been neglected and left to suffer in silence. Lily's fingers gently traced the dog's collar, which had been hidden beneath the thick, matted fur. The collar was old, weathered, and stained, but there was something about it that caught Lily's attention. She pulled it into the light and noticed something odd. There was a tag on the collar, barely legible, but still there. With trembling hands, she wiped away the grime and dirt, revealing faint letters that read, "Rex." It was a name, a reminder that this dog had once been loved or at least had once belonged to someone. The collar had clearly been worn for a long time, and it looked like it hadn't been taken off in ages. It was tightly fastened around the dog's neck, leaving deep indentations in the fur. But what struck Lily the most was the realization that this dog had been left to suffer. Abandoned in the middle of a storm. She sat back on her heels, staring at the collar for a long moment, trying to make sense of everything. The dog had clearly been mistreated, probably left tied up and forgotten. The storm had caught her by surprise, and Lily couldn't help but feel a deep anger toward whoever had done this. She had been left alone, chained to a tree, unable to escape, and forced to endure the pain of both physical abuse and the looming threat of giving birth in such an uncertain state. Lily felt a surge of compassion for the dog, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of injustice. No animal should ever be treated this way, left to suffer and struggle without anyone to care for them. "Grandma, I think she was abandoned," Lily said softly, her voice breaking. She's been left out here in the storm. And she's going to have puppies soon. She's so weak. What should we do?" Her grandmother, who had been quietly observing, stood up and walked over to the dog. She knelt down beside her, running her fingers through the dog's matted fur with gentle precision. "Poor thing," her grandmother murmured. "She's been through hell, but you did the right thing bringing her in. Lily, we can help her. We just need to keep her calm and give her the care she needs." Lily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She had done what she could to help the dog, but there was still so much more to be done. The shepherd was far from safe. She was clearly in pain, and her body was so weak from being neglected for so long. Her swollen belly, heavy with pups, was a constant reminder that time was running out. Lily glanced down at the dog, who was now resting by the fire. Her eyes closed in exhaustion. "We can't just let her suffer," Lily said, her voice firm. "We need to make sure she gets the help she deserves." Her grandmother nodded. "We'll call the vet, Lily. We'll get her the help she needs. And if she's going to have those pups soon, we'll be ready for that too." Lily gently placed a hand on the dog's head, stroking her gently. The dog didn't flinch this time. She seemed to understand that Lily was here to help, that she wasn't going to be left alone again. Her eyes opened briefly, and for a moment, Lily thought she saw something in him, something that resembled trust. "We'll take care of you," Lily whispered softly, her heart swelling with determination. "You're not alone anymore." As the fire crackled and the storm continued to rage outside, Lily felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over her. This was more than just helping a dog in need. It was about showing compassion in the face of suffering, standing up for the animals that couldn't protect themselves. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of emotions that Lily felt as she sat with the dog. She had saved her from the elements. But the real challenge was ahead. There were still so many questions, so many uncertainties. But for the moment, at least, Lily knew one thing: the dog was no longer alone. And Lily would do everything in her power to make sure she had a better life. One full of love and care. The night stretched on, the storm outside still howling. But inside the warmth of the small cottage, there was a quiet peace. A peace that came from knowing that, in some small way, she had made a difference. The night had been long. The storm still raging outside. But inside the cottage, there was a sense of quiet urgency. The German shepherd, now safe and dry, was lying comfortably in a warm corner of the living room, surrounded by blankets. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, providing a steady warmth that made the room feel like a haven against the storm. Lily's heart raced with anticipation as she sat by the dog, gently stroking her fur. Her grandmother, always calm and steady, moved quietly around the room, preparing for the birth. The dog was panting softly, her body trembling from the strain. But Lily could see the glimmer of hope in her eyes. She had been through so much already. Abandoned, mistreated, and left to suffer in the storm. But now she was here, surrounded by love and warmth. Lily held the dog's head gently in her lap, whispering soft words of comfort as her grandmother prepared towels and blankets nearby. Lily had always dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. And though she had never experienced something quite like this before, she felt a deep, natural instinct guiding her. The dog had trusted her. And now it was her turn to help. After what felt like hours, the first puppy arrived. It was tiny, its small body trembling as it took its first breaths. The shepherd mother licked it gently, nuzzling it with a tenderness that made Lily's heart swell. She felt a tear slip down her cheek as she watched the new life enter the world. The second puppy came shortly after, just as strong and healthy. And then the third. All three were perfect, their tiny bodies wriggling as they searched for warmth and comfort. Lily smiled through her tears, her heart filled with joy and relief. She had saved the dog. And now, the dog had saved herself, bringing new life into the world. "Look, Grandma," Lily whispered, her voice filled with awe as she looked at the 3 puppies. "They're beautiful. I'm so glad we could help her." Her grandmother, who had been quietly observing, smiled warmly. "You did more than help her, Lily. You saved 'em all, and that's a special thing." The puppies snuggled close to their mother, their tiny bodies moving instinctively toward her warmth. The shepherd, now exhausted but content, lay down and allowed him to nurse. Lily stayed by her side, feeling the bond between them grow stronger with each passing moment. The storm outside continued to rage. But inside, the little family was safe, nestled together in the warmth of the cottage. The next day, as the storm slowly subsided, Lily and her grandmother knew that they couldn't simply forget about what had happened. They couldn't let the cruelty the dog had experienced go unnoticed. After ensuring that the shepherd and her puppies were comfortable and settled, Lily took the first steps to make sure the situation was addressed. She contacted the local authorities to report the animal abuse. Her grandmother helped her write down all the details, and together, they provided as much information as they could about the neglect the dog had endured. They also reached out to animal protection organizations, asking for their help in investigating and ensuring that justice would be served. In the meantime, Lily devoted herself to caring for the German shepherd and her puppies. Each day, she fed them, bathed them, and spent hours playing with the puppies as they grew stronger and more curious about the world around them. She gave each of them a name. The first puppy, a curious little female, she named Bella. The second, a playful male, she called Max, and the third, a calm and gentle little boy, she named Charlie. As the days passed, the puppies grew quickly, their tiny bodies becoming stronger, their playful antics bringing laughter and light into the home. The mother, whom Lily had come to call Rosie, had become more relaxed, more trusting of the safety Lily had promised her. Despite the overwhelming work it took to care for them, Lily felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew that this was what she was meant to do. The love she had for animals, her desire to protect them, had never felt more real or more necessary. She had saved Rosie and her puppies, and in doing so, she had given them a chance at a new life. But she also realized that this was only the beginning. She would continue to protect them, to care for them, and to make sure that no harm would come to them again. Weeks passed, and the puppies grew bigger, more energetic. They had learned to walk and play, their little paws now running across the floor of the cottage, exploring the world around them with wonder. Rosie, once so frail and fearful, now stood proudly by her puppies, her coat glossy and her body healthy. It was amazing to see how far they had all come. From the terrified, abused dog tied to the tree in the storm to the happy, thriving family that Lily and her grandmother had helped nurture. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. One bright, sunny afternoon, after several weeks of tender care and love, Lily and her grandmother stood in the garden, watching the puppies chase each other around the yard. The sun shone down, casting long shadows on the grass, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and playful barking. The storm had long passed, and now the world outside seemed peaceful once more. Lily watched as Bella, Max, and Charlie tumbled over each other, rolling in the grass, their little tails wagging with excitement. Rosie lay on the porch, watching them fondly, her eyes soft with contentment. Lily's heart swelled with happiness as she realized that this little family had become a part of her own. They had gone from a place of pain and neglect to a place of love and safety. And it was all because she had been willing to act, to step forward and help when it seemed like everything was against them. Her grandmother, standing beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "You've done something wonderful, Lily. You've given him a second chance at life. And in doing so, you've made this family your own." Lily nodded, her smile wide. "They're a part of our family now. We'll take care of them. Just like we promised." As the puppies tumbled into the grass and Rosie wagged her tail, Lily knew that the journey she had started that stormy night had come full circle. She had saved them, but in doing so, they had also saved her. The bond they shared was unbreakable. And as the warm sunlight bathed them all in its glow, Lily knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, protection, and the unspoken understanding that they would always be there for each other. The story of Rosie and her puppies had a happy ending. But Lily knew that this was only the beginning of her own journey. She had learned the true meaning of compassion, sacrifice, and the power of love. And as she watched her puppies play under the warm sun, Lily knew that she would continue to protect them, to care for them, and to stand up for those who couldn't speak for themselves, just as she had done that stormy night when she heard the cry for help.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.